Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 6, about interest groups and political parties, and this is Lesson 1, about Madison's factions. In this lesson, you'll learn about Madison's factions, about the problem of factions, about Madison's solution to that problem, and about de Tocqueville's associations. James Madison has been mentioned previously in this course. James Madison is sometimes called the father of the Constitution. He was the person who showed up at the Constitutional Convention with a plan for a new form of government. After the Constitutional Convention wrote the Constitution and sent it out to the states to be ratified, James Madison, along with a couple of other men, wrote a series of letters to newspapers in New York, which have become collectively known as the Federalist Papers. We've mentioned some of Madison's writings from these letters in previous lessons. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the arguments that he made in Federalist 10. In Federalist 10, Madison begins to discuss the problem of factions in American society. Factions he defined as a number of citizens who are united by some sort of common passion, which then leads them to adversely treat the rights of other citizens. So let's summarize this definition of faction that James Madison provided for us. A faction is a group of people with a common desire that conflicts with the desire of the majority in society. So we're talking about a smaller group of people who are then going to try to pursue something that may not be for the best for everyone. Madison goes on in Federalist 10 to then discuss how the people involved in these factions have differences of opinions with each other. Those differences of opinions then lead them to oppress each other rather than to cooperate with each other. This then produces the problem of factions. Remember, a faction is a group of people that have some sort of common interest they're trying to pursue that may not be for the good of everyone. Therefore, when they obtain power, they will use that power to achieve their ends that they want, whatever they are, even if in doing so, it's harmful for other people. So they have this tendency to end up oppressing and hurting others rather than cooperating with others for the common good. This problem of factions was something not just that Madison observed at the time of the founding of the United States of America, but it was considered a problem throughout political history that all countries had to deal with. And historically, the most common solution that was suggested to the problem of factions was to limit countries to small, homogeneous populations. In other words, groups of people that would be so similar to each other that their interests would all be in common. So whatever people gained control of the government, as they sought to meet their own needs and desires, those would be the same needs and desires of the general population. So essentially, the entire country would be made up of a single faction. That way, whatever group got in charge wouldn't be oppressing everybody else because everybody else is of their same group. Historically, that was viewed as the way to solve this problem of some group taking over the government of a country and then using its power to get what they want while oppressing others. You simply make the country so small that everybody's part of the same group. But that historical solution was not valid for the United States of America. So think about the situation that James Madison was in. He was the father of the Constitution. He had proposed much of the structure of this new government that then was put into the Constitution. The Constitution then went out to the states to be ratified, and he was trying to argue for its adoption. But he was faced with this commonly held concern about factions, and the commonly held solution was going absolutely contrary to the notion of creating the United States of America, which would actually be made up of a large country or I should say, it would compose a large country made up of smaller communities. So rather than just having these small communities ruling themselves, he was trying to bind a bunch of them together. So the historical solution would not work. So he had to propose a different solution. In Federalist 10, he talks about how republics have an advantage over democracies in controlling factions. And the basic idea is that in a republic, you have representatives of the people. Representatives, hopefully, are not as easily swayed by the passions of a given moment. They're also more concerned about gathering support from a broader range. While in a pure democracy, if you have the majority on your side, you can simply rule and oppress others. Matter of fact, that was at the time what was commonly viewed to be the result of democracy, something that we called mob rule earlier in the course. Whatever group has the majority would seize all the power, get what they want, and wouldn't care about how that might hurt the minority in society. So the thought was representative government, where it isn't just the mob ruling based on their passions, might be better for the minority. The representatives would hopefully be wiser and better educated than the masses of the people, and they might have an interest even in attracting some support from the minority in a given situation. So there was this belief that a republic was superior to a democracy in fighting the problem of factions. So Madison proposes this idea in Federalist 10 that a republic is superior, and points out that that's what they were creating with the United States of America, a representative government that, at least in some ways, would then hopefully do better with this problem of factions than a pure democracy would. But he then goes on to talk about how this new republic that they are creating would provide an additional advantage, perhaps a more important advantage. And that is, it would be a large republic rather than a small republic. And what does that do? It makes sure that whatever sort of improper goal a faction has that might end up oppressing other people would never gain enough support to actually be put into effect and oppress those people. The reason for this would be in a large republic, there are so many different groups with so many different ideas of how the country should be run, that no one of them is large enough to actually seize control of the government and then use that government to oppress others. So this is viewed as one of Madison's great theoretical breakthroughs. This idea that the way to control factions is not through having a small country, which was the historically suggested solution, but rather have a very large country with lots of different interests, lots of different views in it, none of them big enough to actually control the country on their own. This would then force them to get anything done, to compete with each other and eventually compromise with each other. So no one of these factions is going to get everything they want. They will have to give in, and in that way, their worst excesses will be toned down and not be harmful to the others in the society. This tendency toward the formation of factions that Madison was trying to deal with was noticed by others. One particularly prominent person who noticed this issue in American society was a French diplomat and social scientist named Alexis de Tocqueville, who toured America in 1831 and later wrote a very influential book about his observations that he had while in the country. In that book, called Democracy in America, de Tocqueville observed that no other country in the world is so freely involved in the in the creation of private organizations or associations. What de Tocqueville was referring to as associations, Madison would call factions. So he was observing that Americans had a very obvious tendency to create these associations or factions. A historical explanation of why this might happen can be seen in the history of the founding of the colonies that eventually became the United States of America. In a previous lesson, you were taught about the principle of salutary neglect, that essentially the government back in England left the colonists alone for hundreds of years here in America. And they kind of learned how to solve their own problems and rule themselves while they were left alone. Well, if they were left alone by the government, but had to work out ways to solve their own problems, they had to do it by learning to develop their own private organizations in order to meet their needs. And so this developed a tradition, a habit of forming these private associations that became a sort of defining feature of American society as de Tocqueville observed it. By forming these private organizations or associations with each other, what Madison would call factions, this allowed people in the United States of America to find other people with the same views, to unite with them, and then through that uniting, to bring themselves more power in society. So Americans, he discovered, were very willing to enter in these private organizations, more so than what he saw in other people around the world. Then, as they did so, this would bring power to them. A group of people working together is going to be more powerful than an individual person. And this doesn't just bring them power to solve the private issues in their lives. It brings them power to help them possibly dominate political processes too. So through uniting in these private organizations or associations or factions, Americans would gain political power. This is why they were so common for Americans to do, and why they were such a concern for people like Madison. So Madison's factions were de Tocqueville's associations. And today we use a different name to talk about them. We call them interest groups today. And talking about them as interest groups will be the topic for the next lesson. Now let's review what you learned in this lesson. First, what is a faction? Is it a group of people with a common passion? Is it a ruling majority? Is it a group that acts quickly? Or is it reality-based decision-making? A faction is a group with some sort of common passion, some sort of common interest that they're trying to pursue. Now, it could potentially be a majority, but it doesn't have to be. It could potentially act quickly, but it doesn't have to be. It could potentially be making its decision based on realities, they might say, but it doesn't have to be. What makes a group a faction is that they have this common passion or purpose that they're trying to pursue. Why were factions considered bad by people like James Madison? Is it because they invade other countries? Is it because they fail to get power? Is it because they spend too much? Or is it because they oppress others? There is a belief that Madison had, and most people in politics at the time, that factions would use their power to oppress others. As one group tried to get what it wants, it would implicitly harm others that were trying to achieve different things. So what was Madison's solution to this problem of factions? Was it to create a small republic, or create a large republic, or create a large democracy, or create a small democracy? Madison argued for a large republic. He believed that a republic was better than a democracy in controlling factions because it wasn't subject to the passions of mob rule. And he believed that a large republic was better than a small republic because you would have so many factions that no one of them could ever control the government. None of them would be big enough to do that. And so they would have to compromise and work with each other. How are Americans different regarding associations compared to other countries of the world, according to Alex de Tocqueville? Is it that they don't trust associations? that they form associations more often, that Americans form less associations, or that Americans are simply not as political? The correct answer is that Americans are more likely to form associations. That completes this lesson. The next lesson will also be from Unit 6. It'll be Lesson 2 about interest groups.